On a cold morning in the spring of 1992, a construction crew was working near the Chicago River. It looked like an ordinary job. Workers had done this kind of work countless times before. But then one piece of equipment struck something hidden beneath the street. At first, no one thought much about it. The opening seemed small, almost harmless. But within hours, engineers realized they had touched part of a forgotten underground network that most people didn't even know existed. Water from the Chicago River began pouring into a tunnel beneath the city. Not a sewer, not a subway, something much older, something built almost a century earlier. As millions of gallons of water rushed through the darkness, downtown office buildings began flooding from below. Basements filled. Elevators stopped working. Businesses closed. The streets above looked almost normal, but beneath them, an invisible disaster was spreading through passages that had nearly vanished from public memory. The accident left city officials asking an uncomfortable question. How could a massive underground tunnel system still exist beneath one of America's greatest cities, and so many people had forgotten it was there? The answer begins long before 1992. It begins in a very different Chicago. Imagine standing on State Street in 1906. The air smells of coal smoke. Streetcars rattle past every few minutes. Horse-drawn wagons fight for space with delivery carts. Factory whistles echo across the city. Chicago is booming. Every day, thousands of tons of coal, food, machinery, and merchandise arrive by railroad. Every one of those supplies must somehow reach offices, hotels, department stores, and warehouses spread across downtown. There is only one problem. The streets can no longer keep up. Traffic jams were becoming so severe that newspapers of the time regularly complained about delayed deliveries and crowded roads. Business owners lost money waiting for shipments. Teamsters argued over blocked intersections. What had once been a sign of prosperity was becoming one of the city's greatest challenges. City engineers faced a difficult question. Should they widen the streets? Build more elevated railways? Or could there be another solution, one almost no one would ever see? According to engineering records preserved by the Chicago Tunnel Company, a bold idea began taking shape beneath the city itself. Instead of sending freight through crowded streets, they would send it underneath them. Quietly, crews began digging below downtown Chicago, not for passengers, not for tourists, but for something much more practical. A hidden freight railroad. As construction continued, brick by brick, a second transportation system slowly appeared beneath the city. Workers built strong arched tunnels just large enough for small electric locomotives. Narrow tracks stretched beneath busy streets. Hidden connections reached the basements of office buildings, hotels, and department stores. Most Chicago residents never saw any of it. In fact, that was the whole point. The tunnels were designed to keep heavy deliveries out of public view, allowing the city above to move more freely while another world worked below. Imagine arriving at work in a tall office building in 1908. Coal is already heating the furnace. Mail has reached the basement. Supplies have been delivered before sunrise. Everything seems effortless. But beneath your feet, workers have spent hours moving freight through dimly lit brick tunnels that almost no one outside the system will ever enter. It was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in America. Yet history rarely remembers the systems that simply worked. Old engineering photographs show clean brick walls disappearing into darkness. Small electric locomotives pulled freight cars loaded with coal and merchandise. Maintenance crews inspected tracks by lantern light. Every tunnel was carefully measured, reinforced, and mapped. This was not a secret built to hide something. It was an engineering solution built to solve a growing city's biggest problem. And for years, it succeeded. So why did almost everyone forget about it? How can 62 miles of tunnels connected to hundreds of buildings beneath one of America's busiest cities slowly fade from public memory? The answer wasn't a single event. It happened so gradually that almost nobody noticed. New roads replaced old ones. Trucks became faster. Buildings changed ownership. The men who built the tunnels retired. The people who operated the underground trains disappeared from the workforce. Maps were updated. Old blueprints were placed into storage. And generation by generation, Chicago continued to grow above a hidden world that fewer and fewer people remembered. But history has a strange habit. Sometimes it waits quietly beneath our feet until one unexpected moment forces the world to look down again. In the next chapter, we'll step inside that underground world itself, following the tiny electric trains that once carried an entire city's lifeblood through brick tunnels that most Chicago residents never even knew existed. Before the first office lights came on each morning, another Chicago was already at work. It had no crowded sidewalks, no streetcars, no horse-drawn wagons, only the sound of small electric locomotives echoing through miles of brick tunnels beneath the city. Few people walking above ever realized that directly under their feet, an entire freight railway was operating almost every hour of the day. According to surviving engineering records, the tunnels were built only large enough for narrow electric trains. Steam engines would have filled the tunnels with smoke, so engineers chose electric power instead, an advanced decision for the early 20th century. Each train pulled small freight cars loaded with coal, mail, building supplies, machinery, and merchandise. The tunnels connected hundreds of commercial buildings across downtown Chicago, allowing deliveries to happen almost invisibly. Imagine owning a department store in 1910. Your customers arrive through the front doors. They browse the latest products. Everything appears perfectly organized. What they never see is the hidden journey those goods took before reaching the shelves. Hours earlier, they arrived underground. Tiny electric trains carried them through dark brick tunnels. Workers unloaded the freight in the basement. Freight elevators quietly lifted everything to the sales floors above. From the customer's point of view, it looked effortless. But beneath the building, dozens of workers had already finished half a day's work before most people even arrived downtown. That hidden system became one of the reasons Chicago could grow so quickly during the early 1900s. The streets above remained crowded, but they were no longer carrying every delivery. The tunnels were quietly sharing the burden. And they didn't move, only merchandise. Coal was one of the tunnel system's most important cargoes. In winter, nearly every large office building depended on coal-fired heating systems. Before the tunnels, heavy wagons delivered coal through busy streets, often creating delays and traffic. The Underground Railway changed everything. Coal could be delivered directly into a building's basement without blocking traffic above. At the same time, another train might be removing ash and waste from that very same building. It was a complete underground supply chain decades before anyone used that phrase. Historians often describe it as one of the most practical engineering solutions of its era. Yet despite its success, the tunnel system faced a problem no engineer could completely control. Technology never stops changing. By the 1920s and 1930s, trucks had become faster, stronger, and more reliable. Roads improved. Loading equipment became more efficient. Businesses slowly discovered that many deliveries could once again be handled above ground. The tunnel network was still useful. But it was no longer essential. The change happened so gradually that few people noticed. Some tunnel routes remained busy. Others carried less freight every year. Certain connections were permanently closed as older buildings were demolished or replaced. One by one, entrances disappeared behind new construction. A modern office tower would rise where an older warehouse once stood. Its basement might still contain a tunnel entrance, but most employees had no reason to ask where that locked steel door actually led. Years passed. The workers who had operated the underground trains retired. Engineers who knew every tunnel by memory left their jobs. Some passed away. Their knowledge was preserved in technical drawings and engineering files, but those documents were rarely read outside professional circles. By the middle of the 20th century, something remarkable had happened. The tunnel system had not disappeared. It had simply faded from everyday conversation. History had not been erased. It had become ordinary, and ordinary things are often the easiest to forget. Then came April 1992. Construction crews working near the Kinsey Street Bridge accidentally damaged the wall of one of the old freight tunnels while driving support pilings into the riverbed. At first, inspectors believed the crack was small enough to repair, but water from the Chicago River had already begun finding its way inside. Hour after hour, the opening grew larger. Water spread through the old tunnel network exactly as its builders had designed it to carry freight. Only this time, the tunnels were carrying something entirely different. By sunrise the next morning, millions of gallons of river water were racing beneath downtown Chicago. Office buildings began flooding from below. Basements disappeared underwater. Electrical systems failed. Businesses shut their doors. Many Chicago residents watched the news in disbelief. They weren't asking why the buildings had flooded. They were asking something far stranger. What tunnels? For millions of Americans, it was the first time they had ever heard that an entire underground freight railroad still existed beneath downtown Chicago. And as emergency crews rushed into the darkness to stop the flooding, they uncovered something even more fascinating. The forgotten tunnels were far larger and far better preserved than almost anyone had imagined. When the floodwaters were finally brought under control, Chicago faced a question that no one had expected. What exactly was still hidden beneath the city? For weeks, engineers, city officials and maintenance crews entered sections of the tunnel network that had not been carefully inspected for years. Some passages had remained dry for decades. Others were covered with mud left behind by the river water. As workers walked through the tunnels with powerful lights, they found something remarkable. The brick walls were still standing. The steel rails were still in place. Old switches that once guided tiny freight trains could still be seen beside the tracks. In some sections, the tunnels looked almost frozen in time. It was as if the city had simply closed the doors one evening and never fully returned. Historical engineers would probably not have been surprised. The tunnels had been built to last. According to engineering records from the early 20th century, every section beneath downtown Chicago was carefully reinforced with brick and concrete because it had to support thousands of tons of buildings, streets and traffic above. The builders knew these tunnels would carry heavy freight every day. They expected them to survive for generations, and many of them did. As investigators compared what they found underground with original city maps, another interesting detail appeared. Some tunnels matched the old blueprints almost perfectly. Others did not. A few branches shown on maps from the early 1900s no longer appeared on later engineering drawings. At first glance, that sounds mysterious. But historians offer a much simpler explanation. Chicago never stopped rebuilding itself. Old buildings were demolished. New skyscrapers replaced them. Utility lines were installed. Roads were widened. Whenever major construction took place, parts of the tunnel system were sometimes rerouted, shortened, sealed, or filled to make room for newer infrastructure. Large cities change constantly. Underground, they change just as much as they do above ground. Still, the forgotten sections captured people's imagination. Urban explorers began talking about hidden passages beneath downtown. Old newspaper articles were rediscovered. Historic photographs spread across museums, libraries, and later the internet. Many people were shocked to learn that Chicago had once operated what was essentially an underground freight railroad beneath one of the busiest business districts in America. But with growing interest came growing myths. Some stories claimed the tunnels stretched far beyond downtown. Others suggested they connected to secret government facilities. A few even claimed there were abandoned underground stations filled with forgotten trains waiting in complete darkness. These stories make exciting headlines. However, historians have found very little reliable evidence to support them. The documented history is already extraordinary without adding legends. The real tunnel network was impressive because it actually existed. It carried coal, mail, freight, building materials, and for decades it helped keep one of America's fastest growing cities moving. Perhaps the most surprising part of this story is not that the tunnels were forgotten. It is that they became almost invisible while still existing beneath thousands of people every day. Think about that for a moment. Every morning, office workers hurried to meetings. Tourists visited famous Chicago landmarks. Millions of people crossed downtown streets. Just below them, brick tunnels built more than a century earlier remained hidden beneath their feet. Most never realized they were walking directly above one of America's greatest engineering achievements. That raises another question. Could something similar happen today? Many historians believe the answer is yes. Modern cities constantly replace old systems with newer ones. Railroads become highways, factories become apartments, warehouses become museums. Over time, yesterday's technology slowly disappears from everyday memory. Not because anyone tries to erase it, but because each new generation grows up surrounded by something different. History is often forgotten, one building at a time, one street at a time, one generation at a time. Chicago's tunnel network reminds us that remarkable achievements do not always vanish. Sometimes they simply become part of the city's foundation, hidden, quiet, almost invisible, waiting for someone to ask the right question. And perhaps the biggest surprise of all was still waiting, because historians eventually discovered that Chicago was not the only American city to build hidden infrastructure beneath its streets. In fact, once researchers began looking more closely, they realized forgotten underground worlds existed in places few people would ever expect. Imagine visiting downtown Chicago today. You step out of a train station. Glass skyscrapers rise above you. People hurry across busy intersections with coffee in one hand and a phone in the other. Delivery trucks unload packages. Traffic moves through streets that never seem to sleep. To most people, this is simply modern Chicago. But beneath those sidewalks, history is still there. Not as a legend, not as a conspiracy, but as a documented engineering project that helped shape one of America's greatest cities. Although the freight trains no longer run through the old tunnel network, much of the system still exists beneath downtown. Some sections have been sealed for safety. Others have been adapted over the years to carry utility lines, communication cables, and other services that keep parts of the city operating. In other words, the tunnels never completely disappeared. They simply found a new purpose. That may be the most surprising part of this story. When people hear the words forgotten tunnels, they often imagine abandoned passageways collapsing beneath the earth. Chicago tells a different story. Its tunnels survive because they were built with extraordinary care. Engineers in the early 1900s understood that everything above them, streets, buildings, and thousands of people, would depend on the strength of those brick walls. More than a century later, many sections still prove how well they did their job. For historians, the tunnel system represents something much larger than transportation. It represents a moment when American engineers looked at an impossible problem and refused to accept the obvious solution. Instead of widening every street, instead of accepting endless traffic, they created another transportation system beneath the city itself. It was bold, practical, and decades ahead of its time. Today, cities around the world are once again exploring underground delivery systems to reduce congestion. In many ways, Chicago's engineers had already tested that idea over 100 years ago. That is why the tunnel network continues to fascinate researchers. It reminds us that innovation is not always new. Sometimes the future begins by rediscovering ideas from the past. Of course, the internet has added countless myths to the story. Some websites claim the tunnels stretch for hundreds of miles beyond the documented network. Others suggest they hide secret government facilities or forgotten underground cities. Those stories attract attention. But the historical evidence points somewhere else. Engineering reports, municipal records, newspaper archives, and preserved maps all tell a consistent story. The tunnels were built for freight. They connected businesses. They solved a major transportation problem. And when changing technology reduced their importance, they gradually faded from everyday memory. The truth does not need exaggeration. The real history is already extraordinary. Perhaps that is the lesson hidden beneath Chicago's streets. History is not always lost because someone erased it. Sometimes it disappears because people simply stop talking about it. One generation builds something remarkable. The next generation depends on it. The generation after that barely notices it. And eventually, only old photographs, engineering drawings, and forgotten newspaper articles remember the full story. That is why archives matter. They preserve the quiet achievements that helped build the modern world. Without those records, many people would never know that an entire freight railway once operated beneath one of America's busiest cities. Before we end, think back to the question we asked at the beginning. How could an entire underground railroad beneath Chicago be forgotten? Perhaps it was never truly forgotten. The records survived. The maps survived. The tunnels survived. What faded was public memory. And there is an important difference between something being hidden and something simply being overlooked. That difference changes how we understand history. Because if a project as large as Chicago's tunnel network could quietly slip out of everyday conversation, how many other remarkable chapters of American history are still waiting inside old archives, forgotten photographs, and engineering records? At the Vertical Archive, that is exactly what we continue to investigate. Not to rewrite history, not to chase myths, but to uncover the documented stories that time quietly pushed into the background. Because sometimes the most fascinating discoveries are not buried beneath ancient ruins. They are hidden beneath the streets we walk across every single day. And somewhere, beneath another American city, another forgotten story is still waiting to be found.